Hello, everybody. Welcome to another session in the Enviro-Art Gallery's week-long speaker series. Today we have with us Justin Cook. So Justin is based in Durham, North Carolina, but works everywhere. His long-term photographic essays tell stories about resilience and communities living along the edges in America, often by focusing on environmental issues and climate change. He believes storytelling that not only shines light on these issues, but also investigates solutions as crucial to social change. His work has been funded by the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting, Connected Coastlines Initiative, the North Carolina Arts Council, the Puffin Foundation, and honored by the Magenta Foundation, the Society of Professional Journalists, and American Photography. When he's not making photographs, you can find him reading about astrophysics, hunting for fossilized shark teeth, and writing in the first person, and engaging in conversations about COVID-19 and vaccinations like we were just doing. So I will pass it on to Justin. Thank you. Go ahead.
Hey guys, I'm just gonna go ahead and share my screen. That way you don't have to stare at me. It's not awkward. So let's see. All right, can everybody see that? Looks like some photos. Yes, cool, awesome. So I'm Justin, and that was a really wonderful introduction, and I'm excited to be here today on Friday. I'm hoping I'm not keeping anyone from happy hour. But yeah, so I have been working on a story about climate change and sea level rise in North Carolina for the past 4 years. And it's a project I kind of self-directed, which is sort of in line with like the way I do a lot of my work. I have like clients that I work for, but I'm always trying to find stories that I can work on to kind of scratch that itch for storytelling that I sort of grew up doing or came of age doing in newspapers, like community storytelling. A little bit about me. My maternal grandfather was from the Outer Banks, and basically since 2017, I've been photographing and reporting on a tiny 150-year-old cemetery that is slowly being swallowed by the Pamlico Sound. It's right on the edge of the Salvo Deus area, and what's happening is it's eroding because of the overdevelopment and human interference with the processes that build and sustain and change the Outer Banks, which are a strip of barrier islands, and also because increasingly violent hurricanes and sea level rise caused by climate change. It's gonna turn this into a slideshow. So in a worst case sea level rise scenario, scientists believe that 6 feet of global sea level rise by 2100 could inundate the Outer Banks completely. But the effects of that are already being felt today. And a lot of this is due to the NC Highway 12, which threads all the islands, and beachfront homes that prevent the sand from washing from the Atlantic side into across the island and into the sound during storm events. Which naturally causes the islands to grow, widen, and migrate towards mainland North Carolina. Just a couple things to put this in context in terms of climate change. Everybody knows about like CO2 emissions and like greenhouse gases and global warming and that sort of thing. But that's what's known as anthropogenic climate change. And what's happening is essentially burning of fossil fuels has raised CO2 levels in the atmosphere from 280 parts per million, which is right before the Industrial Revolution, so like in the 1700s, to 414 parts per million. And this has happened in only the last 150 years, or conveniently since the first grave was dug at this cemetery. It's a really powerful way to put all this in context, how much change has happened. And this has warmed the global climate. It's begun melting ice sheets, and it's creating stronger, like basically warmer ocean temperatures, which are creating longer lasting and stronger hurricanes, which wreak havoc on the Outer Banks. So this is kind of an aerial view of the Outer Banks looking towards the Tri-Villages area of Rodanthe Waves and Salvo. This kind of gives you a rundown of what I was just talking about. But you can see how thin this dune line is here just in Salvo, or excuse me, Rodanthe alone at Merlo Beach. This really thin area of dunes just north of this house repeatedly washes out, and essentially an inlet is trying to form there, but they keep building the dune back. And if you look in the background, they're building a bridge. It's been kind of nicknamed the Jug Handle Bridge because it looks sort of like a jug handle coming off the island, which will eventually bypass that part of the highway. And from what I understand, they'll let that all go to sea. This is a house in Nag's Head. Was once the first row of houses on Seagull Drive, and they demolished all the rest of the houses. But the owner of this house basically abandoned it, and the county can't do anything about it, and it's basically succumbing to the ocean. You kind of see how much sand has been washed under this house as well. These are the barrier dunes. So what's fascinating about this little strip of land at the cemetery, though, is that you can, by studying it, you can learn a lot about the people connected to it, the effects of climate change on the land, the ecosystem, and on their mental health. So the more I worked with people connected to the cemetery, I realized that they were experiencing some psychological impacts of climate change, and it's particularly solastalgia, which is, it's not really a specific psychological diagnosis. It's more of a philosophical idea that kind of tracked with their experience, but it's a homesickness that they feel because of the environmental changes happening around their home. And you can kind of see, this is the Salvo de Use area, which is the most popular day use recreation area on the Outer Banks. And then down here at the very bottom, there's this really tiny cemetery right on the edge of the sound. And this is 1970. And you can see there's a ton of marsh and shrubs and like little shoreline in front of it then. And then in 2017, after hurricanes over the past decade, they've basically, it's eroded into the cemetery, and it's actually destroyed and sucked out some of the graves. I'm going to minimize this somehow. Hang on a second. There we go. Sorry about that. Oops. Okay. There we were. These are older photos from 2017. It was in much worse shape then. So this is at the cemetery at the end of 2017, when some of the locals were trying to figure out ways to preserve it and keep it from eroding away. And they installed a bunch of sandbags in front of it. And that's the sound at twilight. One of the things that's interesting is even like a really strong southwest wind that blows across Pamlico Sound will push the water up into the cemetery now. But one of the things I really wanted to do with this project was to focus on one small space and how it impacted people, as opposed to doing sort of a broader photo essay about the region. And through the reporting, I met people like Jean Hooper, who's 85. She's born in Salvo, which is this little tiny village just north of the Deus area. She's lived there all her life, and she still wants to be buried there beside her husband and her grandparents, even if the sea eventually takes her bones. This is her at the cemetery posing for a portrait. But what's cool, this is her at the cemetery back in 1945 with her siblings at their grandparents' grave. And I'm not sure if y'all are familiar with the Farm Security Administration, but essentially it was a massive photography project that took place in the 20s and 30s during the Great Depression. And famous photographers like Dorothea Lange traveled across the country and photographed the effects of poverty and the Depression. And there was a follow-up project to this called the Standard Oil Documentary Project in the 40s. And lo and behold, Jean and some people in her family were photographed for that project. And these photos, she has prints of these old photographs, and they're some of her most prized possessions. In fact, she keeps one of them in her, but actually both of these in her family Bible. And one of the things that's interesting about Jean, she lives in this little low-slung house on the Sound side that basically got destroyed during Hurricane Irene, and she lost a bunch of her old photos. So ever since Irene, she keeps these images in her family Bible. That way she can grab it and leave if she needs to in a hurry. But she's only left the Outer Banks once during a hurricane, and she basically refuses to. She's lived her all her life, and she knows how to survive them. And this is one of her quotes: "If I was buried there and the water washed me out, I wouldn't know it anyways. So what difference does it make?" She says. "Might as well be out there at the cemetery, washed out all over the place. I can't swim, but I wouldn't need to then." And that's just Jean in a nutshell. She has deep roots on the island and doesn't ever want to leave. And she's willing to be buried out there. And this is her husband, Burtis, who passed away in 2019. And he's buried out at the cemetery. And this is where it gets kind of interesting. I met Jeannie Creech here on the left and Dawn Taylor through a Facebook group where they were sort of organizing people who are interested in genealogy and preservation of historical sites along Hatteras Island. And they were raising money and working with the National Park Service to basically find ways to preserve the cemetery. So they sort of introduced me to people. They introduced me to Jean, and they helped me understand the area, the tension with tourists, and essentially what was happening on the island. They're pretty hilarious. But the thing that's really fascinating is Dawn is really good at like tracing genealogy through the island. And because my grandfather was from the area, she was able to trace my family line through her family line. And we discovered that we share like a distant relative who was buried in the cemetery, but a storm over the years, storms basically excavated her grave and sucked her body out into the Pamlico Sound. So she's no longer in the cemetery. Her name was Dorothy Midget. Her husband also Little Bannister Midget. So that's pretty weird. And one of the things that's really interesting with them, I was trying to find different ways to tell the story about what it's like to live on an island and you're dealing with sea level rise and hurricanes. So I asked Dawn and Jenny, what are some really important things that you would take with you? Say their house was flooding or they had to leave in a hurry because of a storm. And Jenny had these beautiful letters that belonged to her dad from like, his grandmother, so her great grandmother, his wife, some of his ex-girlfriends, his mother, stuff like that. And they're really, really beautiful. So I photographed them because they're just a different way to tell the story. I've actually never showed these photos before, so this is an exclusive. These are some of Dawn Taylor's photos from her father's scrapbook from the Second World War. So they're really into history and they're really into preserving the culture of the island. This is Dawn's great-grandfather, who was a lighthouse keeper. And that's her great-grandmother's glasses. And when her great-grandfather worked at the lighthouse, he had all these maps and documents like on the walls, and she saved them in this old ammo can from the Second World War. You can see how bad the cemetery was in 2017. These are some exposed coffins. But they were able to install a bulkhead and like a rock, like a riprap barrier in front of it. And, every night around 6 p.m. in the summertime, 7 p.m., the tourists come out there and they fish and they watch the sunset. It's like one of the most beautiful places to watch the sunset on the Outer Banks. That was just a funny moment. But beyond people, there's an entire marsh ecosystem around the Deus area. And I've been photographing that as well and the effects of erosion and sea level rise there. And one thing to note is that the Outer Banks are, they're really skinny, thin islands, but they're a critical buffer that protects mainland North Carolina from the full force of hurricanes. They sustain really rich soundside estuaries and marshes that, like sponges, absorb the force of floodwaters and the force of the waves, which protects the islands from erosion, but they also protect mainland North Carolina from the full brunt of hurricanes. So as these islands wither, the ecosystems are threatened. And without the Outer Banks, ultimately, hurricane storm surges will become increasingly catastrophic for mainland coastal communities and those further inland, especially those that are marginalized due to race and class. Um, this is a tree that slowly drowned as the water table has risen because of sea level rise, and salt water ended up killing it. And you can kind of see how the marsh is eroding. And part of this is because the processes that build the island, the sand overwash that washes across the island, nourishes the marshes and keeps them healthy. But when they don't get that overwash because the highway and because the barrier dunes prevent that, they basically erode. You can see how badly they're eroding here. There's a bunch of exposed roots. Essentially, the marsh is dying. But it's home to like a lot of climate endangered species, including a species of sandpiper called a willet. These are marsh periwinkle snails. So as this ecosystem disappears, these animals disappear as well. That's a hermit crab. I wish I could find the video of me out there standing in the marsh with some studio lights, taking this thing's portrait. It's pretty funny. And that's the cemetery last year in October. You can kind of see how close it is to development. And then all the neighborhoods end, and that's National Park Service land. And that is the Milky Way. And that's it. That's those are the photos. So I'm happy to take any questions or comments or smart aleck remarks or whatever. There's plenty to talk about. So
Thank you so much for sharing your photos, and let's do a bit of a virtual round of applause for Justin before we dive into Q&A. So I do have a few questions actually, but everybody, please feel free to put your questions in the chat, or if we get to a good stopping point, you can feel free to unmute yourselves. My first question is a bit more generic. I just would like to learn a bit more about you and kind of what got you into this field and covering these issues in this way. You were quoting a lot of statistics and numbers and science, and I'm just curious your background and how you got to this point as a photographer.
I mean, so my background's in journalism. I went to UNC Chapel Hill and did their photojournalism program and their reporting classes, and interned around the country at newspapers and worked at newspapers. And I had a job at the Roanoke Times in the mountains of Virginia, and worked in Flint, Michigan, worked in Florida. And community storytelling about communities is sort of how I came of age as a journalist and a photographer. I've done a lot of storytelling about like violence and the effects of incarceration in Durham. But I've always that type of work I worked on for like a decade. And when I was done with it, I was just pretty exhausted and felt really traumatized, and wanted to work on something that I think it was more in line with some of my interest as a child, which was always like science and the environment and nature and stuff like that. And wanting to tell stories about climate change and finding ways to like weave all those things together. But also to tell stories, I felt frustrated by a lot of climate change stories because they felt like they focused on the same things over and over again, where it was like, the visuals of climate change were, starving polar bears, melting ice caps, wildfires and stuff like that. And those are like incredibly important stories to tell. But I felt like when that's all you see, you feel it sort of feels like every environmental, these environmental changes and climate changes or like a Michael Bay movie. And climate change takes so many different forms, and it can be this sort of slow erosion of something. It can be exacerbated by human infrastructure. It can be exacerbated by capitalism. um, it can have mental health effects that are so slow that it's hard for people who are experiencing them to name it. And that's kind of the story that came about when I started working on this project in Outer Banks. The project has shifted quite a bit since when I started it in 2017 to where I am now, because I was more focused on like the environmental side of it, and then just talking to people, realizing like how they're experiencing like a disconnect with their community, and their home was feeling less like home because of what was happening. So I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Yes, it does. And I actually have a quick follow up to that. Just knowing that you've operated in these journalistic spaces, and I think we've noticed a lot of the ways that people are getting their news about the environment is through like news outlets. It's through written, print, or perhaps video journalism. What in photography as your chosen medium stood out to you, or why photography as opposed to like the written word or something like that?
Well, it's at UNC they had a track for graphic design as well in the journalism school, and I was torn between doing that and being a photographer. And I basically just decided that I didn't want to sit in front of a computer all day, and I didn't want to I wanted to I've always been an artist at heart. Like I grew up drawing and like was obsessed with comic books, and like really got into photography in high school, and I felt like the perfect way to blend like that type of art with like storytelling. And then it was later in life in my 30s that I realized I could work on stories about the environment. And I feel like there's kind of that cliche saying that like a picture's worth 1,000 words. And like I think that's sometimes true. I think sometimes words can do things that pictures can't. But I feel like the merging of the two is like pretty powerful. And I think that like if you can, like my background with photojournalism is very like moment driven. It's like being there when like moments are happening. Like, you have to be at the funeral. You have to be in the bedroom when someone is dying. You have to be in these intimate spaces to capture these photos. And like that's one way to tell stories as a photographer. But like there's other types of photography that can tell a story as well. So this work is actually like quite a departure from the way I was working with like moment driven photography. And it's artifacts, it's landscapes, it's quieter, um focused on like time of day, quality of light, and sort of spans of time. um if that makes any sense at all. um Looks like
Yeah.
there's some questions in the comments here, the chat.
Yes, I can read off. We have a question from Emily. So capturing the land eroding away and the ecosystems becoming devastated must feel exhausting and draining. How do you balance these feelings?
Yeah, I mean it is. It's a different type of exhaustion from like working directly with like people. I think it's confusing because when I'm out there, it's like so beautiful. Like regardless of what's happening. I mean, you can see like even in this like balding, thinning marsh, there's like tons of wildlife, and it's just really serene. And like I think a lot of times I get home and I'm just kind of like, man, what a mess. Like, because when you're out there in it, it's pretty, but then you leave and you see like I think especially like during COVID, like the tourists come to Outer Banks and like they don't want to wear a mask, and like there's a lot of like just sort of like nasty politics down there. And the result is you show up and like you watch a piece of land eroding, and it just feels kind of like hopeless. But one thing that really one thing that really centered me was Rachel Carson's work with the sea around us, and just like leaning in, to use that phrase, just the like sheer beauty and awe and like power of like the ocean. And she has this like quote about how like the ocean is like the alpha and the omega. It's like the beginning of the end, and like we all return to the sea. And that actually became a metaphor like when working with Jean, because like really like one day she is going to return to the sea because of the erosion and sea level rise. And like I think that's beautiful. I think it's like there's poetry in that, and it makes you realize that like you just really are in control, um, and you have to kind of there's something like very zen about that you have to like surrender to. That doesn't mean that we can't do things to fight climate change, but knowing that the Earth is going to go on without us because that's what it's always done is really comforting. I think there's this misconception that like we're destroying the planet. We're not really destroying the planet. We're destroying ourselves. We're destroying our chances of like living here in the next 1,000 million years. And that kind of it reminds me that like the planet is actually pretty resilient. So I don't know if that answers your question.
I think that was well said, and definitely something that comes up in environmental spaces. Who are we actually protecting here when we're trying to save the planet? It's ourselves as humans, not necessarily Mother Earth. But our next question is from Boris. Outside of this Outer Banks piece, do you have a favorite photojournalistic essay? What is it, and why is it your favorite? It could be this one also. If this one's your favorite, feel
I
free to say
mean, that I've worked on, I mean, I try not to have like favorite like pictures, but like, I mean, I think like there's like favorite moments in all the essays I've worked in. You know, I think like people inviting me into like really intimate moments of their life is always like really, I mean it's a privilege, you know, like Jean agreeing to like be photographed and talk to you for this story like is a privilege because she's trusting me with like her story. It's like this, it's like it's not really like I mean, like, you know, this is my work, but it's like not really my work. It's a collaboration, and it's their lives, and it's their land that they're on, and like their roots and stuff attached to it. Um, yeah, I mean, I think it's I don't know if I really have a favorite story, but I have like really like favorite moments. I mean, my friend Baxter Miller, who's just she's this incredible photographer who does a lot of work in Eastern North Carolina. We like assist each other and hang out, and you know, she was down there, and I hired her to be an assistant to do that portrait. And oh my God, we were down there, we were making those photos in the sound with Jean, and you know, Baxter's like using a reflector to kind of bounce some light back on Jean, and Jean was so funny. She was like, "Just make me look sexy." Yeah, and I was like, you know, it's like moments like this where like, you know, this woman's inviting you into like her life and to be a part of this work, and like she's out there on this like land she's like deeply connected to, and like you kind of she's like being her true self her sense of humor, like you know, like that stuff is priceless. So I don't know I hope that answers the question. I have plenty of other favorite photo essays about other people though, and I can like send some links to those later on if that helps.
that would be great, actually. The next question I think is an important one, just as you are focusing on underserved communities, historically marginalized communities. Have you done research on the indigenous people who live in this area, the Outer Banks area? Are you doing land acknowledgement? Do you get input from local indigenous communities?
Yes and no. Like it's like it's a complicated question because so there are several tribes that were part of the Outer Banks going way back, and that stuff is like actually deeply tied to the history of Outer Banks. So like I don't know if y'all are familiar with like the Lost Colony. So the one of the first English like colonial like settlements, if you will, um, on Roanoke Island, which is just north of the Outer Banks, um, is where the name Dare County came from. There's a young girl named Virginia Dare, and that colony disappeared, and they don't know what happened to it. And basically, like I think it's one spring, another boat of English people showed up, and the colony was gone. And someone had carved Croatan onto a tree, and that was the only thing left in the village. And that's actually the name of one of the tribes. And for a long time, they thought that they had been like massacred by the natives, but they actually think now that's not true. They think that essentially these English colonists basically like just intermingled with the tribe, and they moved, and they're finding tons of evidence. So like the there's this weird kind of beautiful tangled history there between the natives and the colonists, like finding ways to basically like merge and like live together. And I think that some of the modern day manifestation of that is actually the Lumbee, like further south in North Carolina. They think that some of the Lumbee folks are descendants from this sort of intermingling of like the colonists and the First Nations, the Native Americans that live there. Like Hatteras Island itself is named after the Hatteras tribe, which is an indigenous tribe that was out there. Um, the no part of this statement is that really sadly, when you look at the census demographics of Dare County and the Outer Banks, it is like 85% white. Like it is a super white place. And beyond like the Lost Colony play and theatrics they have in Roanoke at the Roanoke Island, there's like this really kind of sad like Native American history museum down in it's like Frisco, which is just sort of south of Hatteras Island. Um, so for the and I did a lot of reading about that because the Outer Banks is just like a wild place for history. You have like all these native influences out there. There's like pirates, like Blackbeard was out there. There's all this World War II history. All this stuff is just like mingled and intermixed together. Um, but for this work, like the most visual part of it was like what was happening at the cemetery and like essentially these descendants of like these first English colonists that essentially colonized that part of the Outer Banks and the village of Salvo. I think like moving forward though, like yeah, I actually really did want to do more work in the Inner Banks, where there are more descendants of like native tribes and native tribes there, and like lower income African Americans and Hispanic communities that are already really suffering because of climate change. And I can actually I can send y'all some links to some stuff about work that's already being done about that, particularly like in like Lumberton and some areas like that. I'm working now like on a project in Princeville, North Carolina, which is like the oldest African American community founded by formerly enslaved Africans after the Civil War. Um, and that work has been really fun. The people there are just like really warm and like open and like really open to like collaborating with people. But yeah, it's like a really good question because that land acknowledging the native ancestry of that land is like really crucial, and it's really bound to like the history of the Outer Banks. But for this story, I chose to focus on this one piece of land because of the amount of science that we knew about it. Like there's some scientists from East Carolina who've been studying the erosion there for like decades, and he had like all this like research about like um, the erosion rates and like why it was happening and stuff like that. And this was an opportunity for me to kind of like work really closely with the science and sort of visualize it. Um, I don't know if that answers your question. I hope it does.
And I think we're kind of amassing a list of links that you'll have to send us after.
Right.
You want to share those with us, we can put them on the website. But I want to move on. Our next question. So over the years, do you find yourself feeling more optimistic about these environmental spaces and issues, or more pessimistic about potential environmental outcomes for these communities?
No. I mean, so like, I'm not trying to be cynical. I, I don't have a lot of hope because um, I think that like the things that created climate change, like especially like white supremacy, capitalistic, patriarchal consumption and that stuff like that is like it's really damaging. I have hope in the communities that are sort of fighting back on their own, particularly like communities of color. Um, I think like the sunrise movement is really interesting, but like I just think that like unless we address the root causes of what's happening, um, we're just going to be addressing the symptoms, and that's kind of what you're seeing on the Outer Banks right now, and that's kind of what you're seeing like globally with a lot of climate change. Um, I think the last election and the election before that, has really set us back and caused like lots of harm, and it's going to prevent us from doing a lot of things we need to do. I think, oh my gosh, it was a couple weeks ago. It was this podcast I was listening to, and I cannot remember for the life of me. I'm drawing a blank, but there is a woman who said that instead of choosing to be hopeful right now, she chooses to have courage. And that really resonated with me, like in the face of climate change. And the courage part comes, I think it kind of energizes me to kind of like keep working, keep going regardless, because the stories are worth telling, they're worth expanding upon, the fight is worth fighting. And I think that's what keeps me going. That and just the relationships. So I hope that answers your question. It's a little
And
half and half, a little cynical, a little hopeful. Like,
that actually, what you just dove into kind of addresses a question that I had about what you hope to accomplish with your work. Just knowing that when we're talking sea level rise, for example, even if we cut off all of our emissions today, there's a strong likelihood that the sea is going to continue to rise and it could overtake the Outer Banks, the small island in the community that you worked with.
right.
So there's no real solution to that issue. Kind of in terms of purpose, is it purely these stories are worth telling? Is it building memories? Just curious as to what you're hoping your work does.
I think it's mostly, I think it's some of it's preservation work essentially, and I think it's capturing what's happening and showing people. And I think, the biggest thing is like, about climate change science. It can be like very opaque, but if you can find a way to visualize it and see it, um, it can be like more relatable. I think it goes back to like the starving polar bear thing. Like not everyone can relate to that, but I think in doing this work, I thought a lot about like who my audience would be, because I think with this work, I'm not trying to convince climate change skeptics that climate change is real, because that's like a pointless fight and a pointless argument. But deliberately, I was trying to focus on like, how do you convince like white people who believe in climate change, but aren't quite activated or aren't quite invested in like doing things about it. And the Outer Banks is a particularly interesting place because like you have a lot of like wealthy white people who vacation there, but like don't really understand like the question that was asked earlier about like native history, stuff like that. They just don't understand it. They just show up, they're like, oh, this is an island full of vacation homes, this is what it's for, but it actually has a pretty deep history. The people who live there have a very deep history. um, and I think like, it's storytelling, it's preserving, it's capturing, it's saying that like we were here, this is what was happening. And I think the other thing too is like, if you can show people, convince people that like this beautiful space that they love, show them how it's changing, it might convince them to like live differently or to like take action. That could be, there's all sorts of different actions, climate actions you can take. And taking climate action is actually a way to sort of like fight back against the feelings of soul nostalgia and eco anxiety. It could be anything from like trying to eat less meat, or getting involved in organizing. Like organizing is like a really important thing to do, for climate action, and even like you know dealing with soul nostalgia. So there's sort of like multiple purposes for the work, if that makes any sense. I see in the chat, eco art space searched online about the Hatteras Indians, and like they are correct. I think I want to say they were part of the Iroquois or Algonquin tribe, if I remember correctly. Don't quote me on that. Yeah, in Croatan, that was a village, and that was up where modern day Roanoke Island is. So they're correct.
And I'll also note that Eco-Art Space has put a link a bit farther down for those who want to learn a bit more about the Outer Banks. It looks like first settlers information.
Yes, that link is really good. I think it gets into like Chickamaucomico, the life saving station. There's still like tons of native names for like name places there. So it's definitely rich with history.
We can share that link also on the site for those who want to dive a bit more into that history. One question that was sent to me directly, it's a bit wider in scope. What would your dream photo essay with a focus on the environment or nature be? I kind of take that, is there a particular environmental issue or a place, if you had the money to go and document, where would that be? What would that be?
If I would go elsewhere to,
If you had all the money in the world, you can travel anywhere, what environmental issue, what community would you want to document?
Probably ones in North Carolina. I mean, I think that, like, I actually get this question a lot, and I see a lot of like photography students and journalists sort of, they think that like it's just assumption that like the best stories are far away. They're not. They're in your backyard. There's probably a climate change story I could tell in Durham. You know, I mean, it affects all parts of North Carolina. There's just tons of stories here. So yeah, probably just North Carolina. There's a lot of work to do. So I hope that doesn't. I hope you weren't thinking I was going to try to go someplace far flung, but I'm kind of boring, I guess.
No, that's actually a good answer. I think a lot of people have dreams of going to tropical islands and documenting unseen communities, and it's always important to make sure that we're documenting the things that people may overlook because it's not as flashy or so I think that's admirable. Our next question is from Michael. It says, hey Justin, love the Willett photo. For someone who has never done any kind of long-term photojournalism project such as this, how would you recommend that someone get involved with or create something along these lines? Since the core themes you explore here, history, climate change, science, and nature, are also topics that Michael is very passionate about.
It's a good question. I mean, I think it kind of dovetails with what I was just saying. Like, kind of do like, wherever you live, there's probably environmental issues there. And I think that, like every project I work on starts with like a lot of deep research. And this one, that, there was a family connection. So it felt like the right story for me to tell, um, for a number of reasons. But yeah, I mean, but I spent like just tons of time like reading about erosion studies, um, different scientists, like sort of analysis of what was going on down there. Um, I do a lot of work with the National Audubon Society, and they've done some reporting about the Outer Banks. So like that was an interesting like sort of entry point to that. But yeah, I mean, basically nerd out, like find some topics that interest you. Like I remember like there were years ago when I finished a lot of the work I was doing in Durham, I just felt really burnt out. And there was a book that I read, that's kind of a guide to creativity called The Artist Way. And um, part of the goal of it is it sort of makes you kind of center yourself and think about the things that you were in love with as a child. And a lot of those things like never really go away. And I was like really in love with like marine biology and science, stuff like that. And I realized like none of it had gone away. I'd gotten distracted by all these like side quests, like in journalism and everything else. And it kind of recentered me, and it made me realize, it made me just start making like lists of stuff that I wanted to explore like journalistically. And natural science history stories were on there, and the Outer Banks and stuff like that. And it started with research after that. Um, so yeah, just keep a list of stories you're interested in and kind of learn about your state. There's so many stories in North Carolina. The Princeville story I was working on came from an assignment that I had with NC State. And then I just I just love the folks down there, and we hit it off. And like I continue to go down there and work with them. And like actually, I provide some of the people I'm working with like photographs them that they can use to kind of augment like their own storytelling about Princeville. And it's a very like collaborative approach, which is not like traditional journalism where you like sort of show up and take pictures and like publish them and leave, which is kind of like not my style. So embed yourself in a community, like hang out. Like I half the time I show up and I like don't even have my camera out. I'm just like hanging out. So
I think that is a good segue into kind of what's the next passion project. What are you working on now? Slash, what's in the pipeline for you?
I'm trying to finish this. Like, I'm trying to finish it. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's like, I don't know if I really think of it as a passion project. It's just more, this is my job, like to find this stuff and like try to find grant money and try to publish it. But um, I would love to work with some of the communities on the Inner Banks that are threatened. Um, I'm hearing like all sorts of horror stories about like how the sea level rise and saltwater intrusion is making a lot of the farmers like fields like fallow, and like it's they can't grow anything, and that's going to cause migration, and it's going to be a mess. So um if it's in eastern North Carolina, I'm probably interested in it. So um there's some there's some other areas like up in Chesapeake, Virginia that are interesting to me that are going through some similar stuff. But there's also been a lot of stories told about that already. So I'm not sure how much I'll dabble into that. But it's a good question.
There are no other questions from the audience. I wanna allow you to, if there's anything you'd like to leave us with, any parting thoughts, advice, words of wisdom, we'd love to hear it.
I love Eco Art Space's research they're putting into the chat here about Kinnikit. That's pretty cool about how it translates to that which is mixed. If this theory is true, it means the original locals never really left, and a handful, whether they know it or not, clearly still call the Outer Banks home. They're probably right. But man, the census, you should look at the census though. It's like it's like a very white, like land ownership demographic down there. So it would be very interesting to kind of dig into what they're talking about. Um, there's definitely some native influence down there. So um, I don't know. I mean, is there anything I haven't commented on, or any questions y'all have as host? Or my favorite color is blue. I have 2 cats. I have a twin brother. These are random facts about me.
Um, I guess one other, question that I did have was just sort of, as you're working with these communities, as you're working with this community on the Outer Banks, I think one sort of story that comes up when we're talking, whether it's sea level rise or we're talking some sort of extractive industry, pollution impacting a community, the question becomes, why don't the people just move? And I'm curious what your response would be to, like, what do you say if to people who say just tell them to move, just leave?
Yeah, that's a viable solution for some people. Like retreat is a viable solution. Um, but there's a lot of people with like such deep roots to the place that they don't want to. They can't imagine. Like it'd be hard to imagine an 85-year-old Gene Hooper giving up the only place she's ever known and moving. The connection to the community is really deep. The connection to the land is really deep. But also like, when you have few resources, um, because of race or because of economics, like it's physically challenging. One of the things that's frustrating to me, talking to like Dare County officials, their hard line is that, they're raising money every year to do beach nourishment. And beach nourishment is basically dredging sand from out in the ocean and pumping it on the beach and rebuilding the beaches. And they do this specifically to maintain the tourism economy. So they tax people, they get federal funds, they get state funds to basically, I think they're spending $99 million by 2022 to do beach nourishment from the village of Duck all the way down to Buxton. And I asked him, I was like, well, are you considering using this money to help people relocate? And they're like, no, that's not our policy. And the way the legislation is written by the state house, the General Assembly, it won't allow for that. So like, I think that's ridiculous personally. Because there are people who do want to retreat, don't have the means to, don't have the means to sell their house because no one will buy it because it's in a flood zone or it's being eroded, there's no buyout money to help them move. So like the problem gets exacerbated. Um, so that's it's to just tell people to move. Like, well, the question is how. You know what I mean? Like, if you're a really wealthy person who lives in San Francisco and you have a beachfront house in Nags Head that's your second, third, or fourth, or fifth, or 27th home, if it gets knocked into the ocean, you probably, whatever, you'll probably just build a new one, or FEMA flood money will pay for it or whatever. But Jean, she lives in this like little low slung house on the sound side that's surrounded by like mansions. She probably doesn't have those resources. Like, her husband retired. He worked from the fair, basically the NC Department of Transportation. He was a ferry operator. He operated the ferries going back and forth between the islands. Like, they're not really wealthy people. So yeah, but Eco Art Space has an interesting comment. People are having to leave their homes all over the planet due to climate change. It's happening now in California due to fires. The real question is it sustainable? We do not own the land. We are of the land. Yeah, they're right. I mean, that's a really powerful way to think about it. It's like climate migration is going to be like one of the largest issues that we face, like moving forward. And climate gentrification, stuff like that is already happening in Miami, where like really wealthy people are buying up the higher ground in Miami, which could be like 10 feet above sea level as opposed to at sea level. And a lot of that can be in like historically Black, Caribbean, indigenous neighborhoods. They're like not white people, and it's raising prices and forcing them out. So like that's going to create, basically a swell of migrants eventually, and a lot of them will be lower income, historically marginalized. I mean, one of the things interesting about the Outer Banks is like you have a very like rich poor divide there. Like if you think about Durham, like gentrification in Durham, it's sort of like a wealthy white class moving in and gentrifying neighborhoods, and like lower income Hispanic and African American people being pushed out. The Outer Banks, it's like lower income white people that are being affected by like really wealthy people moving in and like buying up land and building these huge mansions that they maybe use 3 times a year and then they rent, or it sits unoccupied. And it changes the whole dynamic of the island. It changes the culture. So and ultimately, if the Outer Banks aren't there, people are going to have to move. If it's really going to be threatened by 6 feet of sea level rise, they're not going to have a choice. So yeah, it's pretty terrible in the long run. And Eco Art Space is correct. So
Cameron and Justin, this is Elaine. Like your friend and kinswoman, Jean, I'm 85 years old, and I would like to say on overcoming the gloom, that gloomy situation that the world is in right now. One of our earlier speakers this week, Travis Mitchell, is that right, Cameron? He said something that I think we need to remember, and that is keep trying. Yes,
yeah.
Keep trying. And he also said, and tend your garden. I just love those two.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Together. Keep trying. Yeah, it's gloomy. It's terrible, but keep trying.
But that's the courage.
And your garden,
yeah.
growing. And so what you do, I want to thank you for your presentation and the stories. I think what you're doing is important. Don't forget that, and keep doing it. It's important.
Well, thank you. It's a privilege, and I mean, I think you're right on the head with that. Like the courage piece is important. You got to keep going.
Well, he's a young man, and he said it. So, I'm just giving him credit that he said, keep trying.
Yeah, he's correct.
Yeah, love it. Thank you so much for what you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think like I keep thinking about what Eco Art Space said about how we don't own the land, we are of the land. And I think that just really resonates. I mean, and that's kind of the way Rachel Carson talked about it in The Sea Around Us. Like,
yes,
we came from the ocean and we're going to return to it.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's kind of biblical. It's, you know, it's in line with like native thinking about how we are one with the land. And,
Yeah.
you know, I wish, you know, I especially wish white people had thought that way for like much longer. We probably wouldn't be in this mess. Um, you know, like one of the things that's an important conversation right now, in terms of like climate ethics and climate equity, you know, like fossil fuel companies have known for decades that what they've been doing has been altering the atmosphere and causing global warming. And there's this myth that I really struggle with, this idea that like we are all responsible for climate change and we all have to fix it. And like, I don't think that's true. I don't think it's true. The other way to look at it is that, you know, there's very specific countries that are most responsible for greenhouse emissions, including the United States, you know, imperial countries in Europe, the U.S. military. There's like 100 fossil fuel companies that are responsible for like, I think it's like 70% of fossil fuel emissions since like the 1950s. And like those are the countries and the companies that are going to have to really like pay the price for this. And, you know, it's just that there's this attitude that like through our individual choices we can save the world and stop this. Well, the other way to look at that is like we haven't had choices for a long time because we haven't had electric cars. It takes privilege to buy those things. So like the real change is going to have to come from the top down, and it's going to be we're going to have to stop burning fossil fuels. We're going to, you know, climate change and climate justice is an opportunity for us to basically reimagine society, and because it intersects with all these other social problems like health, race, class, you know, you name it. Climate change touches it. So
Well, Justin,
um,
do you think that some are looking to colonize the moon and Mars?
yeah, I think Jeff Bezos will do
Away from
that.
here,
I
right?
think not you know, I think people like Jeff Bezos will do that, but that's, you know, it comes with tons of privilege, you know, like it's ridiculous. um you know, he's stepping down from Amazon to probably work on his sort of vanity space projects, which are really cool, but like who's going to be able to afford. The way I look at it is like there's a lot of really wealthy people who are prepping for climate apocalypses and they have their golden parachute ready,
Yes,
and like a lot of the rest of us are going to struggle, and that's where the equity piece comes in. It's not fair. So
yes, thank you. You're right.
you're welcome. Thanks for your excellent question.
I think that to come out of this conversation has been a really awesome analysis of sort of the situation that we as not just we as a society are dealing with. I'm trying to be as eloquent as Elaine and Justin have been in analyzing kind of how the turn that this conversation has gone from an equity lens, from a climate change lens, from a moving forward lens, and the responsibility that we have not just to ourselves and to the planet, but also to hold those in higher power accountable. I think the work that you are doing, Justin, is a good step. The work that I think a lot of our speakers this week have done are good first steps towards like that engagement and that accountability. It looked like you were about to say something, so I want to allow you to say.
Oh, I just, I really appreciate what Elaine said, and you know, she's acknowledging that she's 85 years old, and you know, I can't help but when I'm reading Eco Art Space's comments, I'm assuming this person is young, and one of the things I would love to see is like some intergenerational solidarity and collaboration, because at the end of the day, like a lot of people, you're 60, oh, I'm sorry. I mean, you just sorry, I'm being like totally ageist here. I apologize profusely, but yeah, but like let me reword this. All you young folks who have put together this wonderful Enviro-Art thing, like intergenerational collaboration with people like Elaine and people like Eco Art Space, like, and people like me. There has to be some solidarity. It can't just be the Sunrise Movement. You know, we can't just hate on all baby boomers and think that they ruined the planet. Like, you know, there's got to be like there has to be some solidarity to fix this. And we're not gonna stop climate change, but we can slow it down. You know, we can prevent this world from becoming a total hothouse. Yeah, solidarity.
Yeah, And I think we're fortunate just having seen some of the people who have come to the sessions this week and who submitted artwork. We have a vast array of people of in terms of age groups, in terms of their representation. I think art has done a really good job of acting as a universal language, whether that be across borders, across oceans, or across generations. Just in my observations from this week.
Yeah, and I just tossed my email into the chat. So, Eco Art Space, shoot me an email, whoever. Continue the conversation. I feel fired up now, man. I just really, y'all are great. Sweet. She sent me hers too.
Yeah, please connect. These are great conversations, great potential collaborations here. And so we have hit almost 6:35 here. If nobody else has any other questions or any other launch points for insightful conversation, I want to wrap up by thanking you again, Justin, for your time and for engaging conversation and for, I guess, a real dive into what are difficult, contentious, and important topics to discuss when we're talking about the environment and climate change. And thank you, our wonderful audience, for being so engaged.
And I'll say one last thing. Something that really helped me. There was a book I was reading by this dude who's reporting on about climate change, and he talked to climate change scientists who were really frustrated about climate change storytelling, and they regret being so conservative about their sort of analysis of what was happening. And he told this writer to tell any story you possibly can about climate change. If it's about white people who are old, if it's about indigenous people, because you never know who it might resonate with.